12 news, Bob Fox, and sends it to his available report, all of them from German sources, on what the Berlin radio calls invasion. There is still no Allied confirmation from any source. Correspondents who rushed to the War Department in Washington soon after the first German broadcast was heard were told that our War Department had no information on the German report. There's been no announcement of any sort from Allied headquarters in London. The first news of the German announcement reached this country at 12:37 a.m. Eastern Wartime. The Associated Press recorded this broadcast and immediately pointed out that it could be one which Allied leaders have warned us to expect from the Germans. Shortly after 1 a.m. Eastern Wartime, the Berlin radio opened its news program with a so-called invasion announcement. Columbia shortwave listening station here in New York heard the Berlin radio say, and I quote, "Here is a special bulletin. Early this morning, the long-awaited British and American invasion began when paratroops landed in the area of the Somme estuary. The harbor of Le Havre is being fiercely bombarded at the present moment. Naval forces of the German Navy are off the coast fighting with enemy landing vessels. We just brought you a special bulletin." End of the quotation. That is the invasion announcement as heard from the Berlin radio by Columbia shortwave listening station.
Rifle squad,
Now
ready
here's
for
what
action.
Transocean, one of the German news agencies, says, and I quote, "Early Tuesday morning, landing craft and light warships were observed in the area between the mouth of the Somme and the eastern coast of Normandy. At the same time, paratroops were dropped from numerous aircraft on the northern tip of the Normandy Peninsula. It is believed that these paratroops have been given the task of capturing airfields in order to facilitate the landing of further troops. The harbor of Le Havre is at the moment being bombarded. And," continues the broadcast, "German naval forces have engaged enemy landing craft off the coast." The Transocean broadcast, still unconfirmed, concludes this way: "The long-expected Anglo-American invasion appears to have begun." This is the full text of the German Transocean broadcast as recorded by the Associated
Rifle
Press.
squad, waiting for orders.
The German broadcasts on the long-expected invasion by the Allies were relayed both to North America and to Germans in the homeland. Germans at home were told by DNB's domestic broadcast at dawn in Europe. At 1:30 in the morning Eastern Wartime, the DNB agency repeated the item describing what it called the invasion operation. This was a departure from the usual DNB practice of giving fresh information at that time. The German-controlled Calais radio came on the air today with this announcement in the English language, quote, "This is D-Day. We shall now bring music for the Allied invasion forces." So said the German-controlled Calais radio across the channel from England. Up to this time, almost an hour and a half after the first German broadcast, the United States Office of War Information, whose facilities will be used by American press organizations when Allied armies enter Western Europe, has not transmitted any information at all to support the German claims. Director Elmer Davis of the OWI rushed to his headquarters immediately when OWI officials advised him of the broadcast from
We're
Germany.
losing a capture
He
point.
told the United Press, "We have no more information than you have. I'll stay here until I find out whether the story is true or not." Last night, Elmer Davis addressed the National
Lieutenant
Press
has been
Club on
assigned to field
psychological
ops.
warfare and showed three motion pictures illustrating how the OWI was propagandizing on the war front. He had just reached his home when his office called him to hurry down. By
Frag grenades are
1:45
on
in the
their way
morning,
up to the
Eastern
lines.
Wartime, almost the entire public relations staff over at the War Department in Washington also had
Weapon
reported
rack
for
is
duty.
now open.
Now, it should be remembered, of course, that the Germans are quite capable of faking this entire series of reports. Their main reason for doing so, in addition to trying to smoke out Allied plans, would be to try to start a premature uprising by the resistance movement along the Channel coast. But the French and the Belgians and the Dutch have all been warned about this possibility repeatedly. And you will recall that Prime Minister Winston Churchill some time ago warned that we could expect false alarms or diversionary feints before the big show began. The British radio, which at 1 a.m. Eastern Wartime sent a warning to residents of the Dutch coast to evacuate inland to a distance of at least 18 miles, might merely have been broadcasting the latest in the series of such warnings that have been given to the civilian population all along the so-called invasion coast of Europe. No other British report that might indicate that the invasion is on has been released, unless we are to take as significant a report from London half an hour ago that the Royal Air Force was over enemy territory during the night. Even on the enemy side, there are clear reasons for doubting the German report that the invasion has started. Pious Radio at 1 a.m.
capture point is under attack.
Said nothing about any invasion operations in its regular news report. In fact, half an hour after the first German broadcast announcing the landing, one German-controlled Paris radio station said of the war situation and its location, it appears we have been given another month of grace before the invasion will start. A press report from Washington says Roosevelt will come to London at the end of June.
Ready for
Clearly,
action.
this indicates the event will not start before the end of June, said the Paris radio. Well, as I said, there is as yet no reason to believe the German story. Nevertheless, because of high public interest in this country, Columbia is planning to continue overtime operations tonight to all of its affiliate stations until such time as the enemy accounts are proved false or official word from Allied forces is forthcoming. You may listen to this network with assurance that all sources of news will be properly labeled and that we will interrupt programs only with news of exceptional importance and will bring you frequent summaries of all information available. The Columbia shortwave listening station here in New York has heard the British radio report the German announcement of parachute landing and report the announcement without comment. Then BBC followed that German announcement, which I've already given you, with this, and I quote, "Early this morning, people in German-occupied Western Europe received an urgent warning broadcast by a spokesman of the Supreme Command of the Allied Expeditionary Force. It was that a new phase of the Allied air offensive has begun. People living within 22 miles of the coast are particularly affected. The German overseas news agency, BBC goes on, has been putting out repeated flashes. Here is one of them. Quote, "We've just learned that numerous Allied landing craft and other Allied warships were seen in the area between the Seine estuary and the eastern coast of Normandy." And that was BBC quoting the German report. And now here in the studio with me is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott, and here is Major Elliott now.
We must begin by
Commanders, be advised.
by
Ability now
understanding
ready.
the possibility that these German reports may be an outright German lie. We must also take into account the possibility that they may be a series of feints intended to divert the German defense and to draw the German forces to other places when and those in which we actually intend to make a serious attack. The report that a new phase of the Allied air offensive has begun, and the consequent request to the inhabitants of Western Europe to clear an area 22 miles from the
Krauts
coast
have cut our supply
may
line.
mean
Frontline
nothing
units
more
are being
than
hung
an
out to dry.
intensification of bombing attacks, or it may indicate the use of parachutes, or it may be, again, a part of the Allied attempt to throw the Germans off their guard. But if we are to accept the German report as having any value at all, there seems to be some uncertainty as to the
WPM-110
location of
smoke
the
strike
Allied
can be
landing
delivered to cover
zone,
our men.
which they
We can now
report.
deploy a smoke screen
It
to
is
blind the
clear that
enemy.
the Germans are saying that landing craft have been observed approaching the eastern coast between the eastern shore of what they call the Normandy Peninsula and the mouth of the River Seine, where the port of Le Havre is situated. The Germans are also asserting that this port, Le Havre, is being bombarded, and that Allied parachutes are being landed near the tip of the Normandy Peninsula. What is not clear is the reference made to an Allied landing near the estuary of the River Somme, which is some distance northeast of Le Havre. This may possibly be an error for the Seine estuary, though the actual German translation has been checked several times here in a CBS shortwave listening station. But to analyze all this German, all these German statements, what the Germans call the Normandy Peninsula is undoubtedly the Cotentin Peninsula, at the end of which stands a port of Cherbourg. Allied forces would certainly wish, if they were actually landing there, to obtain a well-equipped seaport as soon as possible. Such a port is essential in order to keep up continuous landings of troops and heavy equipment. We learned at Angel and elsewhere that it is not safe to leave such matters to the mercy of the weather,
overrunning one of our
as
capture
has to be
points.
done when dependence is had on open beaches, or even small but undeveloped bays. Hence, a double Allied attempt against the two chief ports of northern France, Cherbourg and Le Havre, is well within the possibilities if we are to accept the German report that landings are taking place at all. From the strategic point of view, there is nothing inconsistent in the report of the landing at the Somme estuary. There is no seaport of importance there, but the Allies might well wish to land on a broad front in order to divert the German defense as much as possible and to keep the Germans from finding out, as long as we could, where the main effort was being made. The landing of parachutes behind the big seaport of Cherbourg would likewise be probable if the landing was really in progress, in order to cut off the movement of German reserves toward that port and thus facilitate its capture by the Allies. But any military analysis must remain fragmentary and uncertain as long as it is based only on German reports, which have so frequently proved to be unreliable in the past.
A capture point
That
is
was
under attack.
Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott, and I think that brings us up to date to the moment. I'd like to repeat that there is as yet no reason to believe this German story which you have now heard. Nevertheless, because of high public interest in this country, Columbia is planning to continue overtime operations tonight, and I would like to take this opportunity to inform not only you, our audience, but to inform also the staff on duty at our affiliate stations around the country that Columbia is planning overtime operations until such time as the enemy accounts are proved false or official word from Allied sources is forthcoming.
Fighting position machine
So,
gun
ladies
is
and
in
gentlemen, you may
place.
listen to this network with assurance that all sources of news will be properly labeled and that we will interrupt programs only with news of exceptional importance and will bring you frequent summaries of all information available. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
One of our fighting positions is
CBS
sustaining
World
fire.
News, Bob Trout speaking. It has now been nearly 2 hours since the first German radio announcement that the invasion had begun. Frankly, we don't know at this time whether those German news agency reports that the invasion has begun are true or not. However, the scarcity of any details from the Germans in these 2 hours after the first announcement do throw very strong doubt on the possible truth of the German story. Up until this moment, of course, there's been no confirmation from any Allied source that an invasion may have started. Elmer Davis, director of the Office of War Information, says that he too knows nothing of the report. However, late last night, 3 German news agencies flashed word that Allied paratroops were spilling out of the skies over the Normandy Peninsula of France, and that our landing craft had started to come ashore in the Le Havre area, just 80 miles across the English Channel from the coast of Britain. The Germans, still without confirmation, say that Allied flyers are pounding Le Havre and its surrounding territory. The German news agency, BND, also is telling of strong bombing attacks against the Calais and Dunkirk regions of France. Both Calais and Dunkirk lie some 150 miles northeast of Le Havre. This is the way the German Transocean broadcast announced the start of the invasion. I quote, "The long-awaited invasion," said the Germans, "by the British and Americans was begun in the first hours of the morning of June 6th. The Germans then go on to say that their naval forces are now engaged in opposing the Allied landing. According to the German BND agency, no enemy troops have come ashore yet. But again, I repeat, there's absolutely nothing at the moment to substantiate these enemy claims. The British Broadcasting Corporation, meanwhile, has broadcast urgent instructions to the people of France that a new phase in the air war has begun. In an earlier broadcast from Allied headquarters in London, the peoples of occupied Europe were told that once the invasion had started, they would be notified by leaflets. And again, in closing, let me remind you that there is no Allied confirmation of the landings in France as the Germans report. The British radio did add a warning to all persons to evacuate the 22-mile coastal belt as soon as possible. Both Axis and Allied sources mention Allied air activity over the entire coastal area from Norway to central France. Although there's no reason to believe this enemy report, the Columbia network will remain in overtime operation tonight until all the facts are known. We repeat, the network will operate beyond its regular time of closing until the German report has either been verified or has been proved erroneous. This program has come to you from PBS World News. We resume our scheduled program. Now almost 2.5 hours since the Germans first broadcast their claims that what they call the Allied invasion has begun. There's no confirmation from any Allied source, and the Germans are not telling this story to their own people. That's very important. General Eisenhower's spokesman has made no official statement. The War Department in Washington says it has no information about any invasion operation. The OWI is silent. In short, there's no reason to believe the continuing German reports of an Allied invasion. Nevertheless, here are the latest details of what the Germans claim is the Great Anglo-American Invasion. The German Trans-Ocean News Agency, a Nazi propaganda outfit, said at about 12:30 Eastern Wartime that Allied parachute troops had started to land on the northern tip of the Normandy Peninsula. At the same time, Allied warships were said to be shelling the port of Le Havre at the estuary of the Seine River. Berlin said a naval battle between German and Allied light naval units was in progress. The official German news agency, BND, quickly picked up the report and added that the Allied invasion attack appeared to be concentrated in the area between the mouth of the Seine River and the east coast of Normandy. Continuing reports from the Berlin radio say that heavy fleets of Allied bombers are attacking Dunkirk and Calais. The Oslo radio network appears to have gone off the air, and the Luxembourg radio claims that Allied aircraft are approaching southern Germany. Meanwhile, in Great Britain, the British radio has broadcast a warning to the peoples of the occupied countries that a new phase of the air war has started. The British announcement says that occupants of coastal towns will be notified by leaflets dropped from planes when they are to be attacked. The notices may come as little as an hour before the attack, and the inhabitants are warned to leave their towns instantly without waiting to take baggage or any possessions. In addition, the inhabitants of the 22-mile wide belt along the invasion coast have been warned to leave as soon as possible in preparation for this new and drastic phase of the aerial bombardment. But as yet, there is no word that any warning leaflets have been dropped on any towns within the so-called invasion area. This is merely an advance warning of things to come. Incidentally, Germany has seen reports of the supposed invasion to Asia, but as yet the Japanese radio has not picked up these reports. After the first German story about the so-called invasion, the man who is called Captain Ludwig Pretorius, supposedly a military commentator for the German news agency Trans-Ocean, declared flatly that the great conquest, as he put it, has begun between forces of the Reich and those of the Anglo-Americans. He said that Allied landings in the West today have put the German armed forces in the mood which they express with a laconic, "they are coming." He then went on to say that at the present moment, the invasion of Western Europe is at its very beginning, and that nothing can yet be said about the tactical and operational development. This almost an apology for the lack of details. Pretorius then concluded that the German armies are facing the Allied onslaught with single-mindedness of purpose. For in war, said
Rifle
the
squad,
captain,
ready for
with
action.
the typical Berlin flourish, ethical values are at least as important as the number of soldiers and the quantity of their equipment. Washington, like the rest of the nation, is momentarily waiting for official word from our side about these German planes.
Rear echelon
The city of
troops on the
Washington
front
awoke
line.
rapidly after the first broadcast more than 3 hours ago. Lights flashed on and radios were tuned in. You may have had the same experience. Newsmen hurried to their offices, and there was just one question on everyone's lips. Is it official? So far, as we've told you repeatedly, it is not official. If the White House knows anything about the report, there is no sign. Only a few lights glow here and there, and the customary guards are patrolling up and down outside the White House with the same old monotony. Only a few hours earlier, President Roosevelt addressed the nation by radio. He spoke of the fall of Rome, and he said it was a significant victory. But the president added that a long period of greater effort and fighting lies ahead before we get into Germany itself. Elmer Davis, director of the Office of War Information, hurried down to his office in Washington as soon as he heard about the German broadcast. But he says, we have no more information than you have. I'll stay here until I find out whether the story is true or not. Over at the War Department in the Pentagon building, the lights are burning brightly in the Public Relations office. And for almost an hour now, practically the entire Public Relations staff has been on the job. But the War Department says it still has no information. That is about the entire story as far as we know it at the moment. At this point, there's no way in which any of us can know whether there's even a faint spark of truth behind this German story. We don't know. But there are several bits of evidence suggesting that the Germans are trying some kind of trick. We'll have to wait until later before we can be sure. Since the first German report came in about 30 minutes after midnight, Eastern wartime, we've been on the air several times here at Columbia's news headquarters in New York, repeating the facts we know and giving you whatever news has come in. At this point, our Columbia newsroom is a scene of activity rather unusual at this time of the morning, after 3 in wartime. The news machines of the United Press, the Associated Press, the International News Service, and so on, which usually at this hour are slowly, calmly, printing more or less routine news for afternoon papers, are now hammering out every scrap of information from Europe they can get. But even so, there are sometimes long pauses because of the way in which the Germans have put this story out. And now it might be a good idea to take you on a little 3 o'clock in the morning tour of Columbia's newsroom. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to stand up from this table in the studio in which I've been broadcasting, open the door, take the microphone in my hand, walk out into Columbia's newsroom, trailing the long cable behind me. And when we get out in our newsroom, we're now crossing the threshold, I'll read off to you some of the news machines and give you an idea of just what they're printing at this hour of this unusual morning. Columbia's news staff has been quickly assembled, and so many staff members appear so quickly that there are scarcely chairs enough for all members at once. Ned Kelmer, who finished his 11 o'clock broadcast about 4 hours ago, is still here. Major George Fielding Elliott hurried in, among others, and Major Elliott brought with him a very large supply of maps, as you can well imagine. In one of our offices, the radio is permanently tuned tonight to a London circuit so that we can hear whatever comes over on this particular circuit. A table has quickly been set up and now bears large cups of coffee, the inevitable accompaniment to all stories that break abruptly in the night. In some ways, the scene is not unlike those hard-working nights when the Germans were rushing through Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. But there's an awful lot of difference. Even though we're suspicious of this German story, and we think that the invasion very possibly has not begun, still the atmosphere in this newsroom tonight is far different from that on those anxious nights when the Germans were on the offensive. And now I've walked with the microphone down to the end of our newsroom, and the first machine that we come to is the brown teletype printer, which turns out the reports from Reuters. That's the British news agency. And here's what Reuters has just printed. London, Reuters, an officer of the staff of the Allied Supreme Command of the Expeditionary Force today broadcast a warning specially addressed to all Frenchmen living at least within 35 kilometers of the coast. He said, the lives of many depend upon the speed with which you act. And then there was a brief pause. Then Reuters continued. Warning 2. Quote, the air war has entered upon a new phase. This, of course, is what the spokesman said. The air war has entered upon a new phase. You will be warned an hour before an attack. Leaflets will be dropped by Allied planes. As soon as you get the warning, go to your domicile and go at least 2 kilometers from it into the open country. 2. Take along only what you can easily carry. 3. Keep off all roads, railway lines, and bridges. 4. Do not form groups, which could be mistaken for troop concentration. That's what Reuters is printing at the moment, and as all newsmen will recognize, the inevitable little postscript, the machine says correction and warning 2, read it carry, paragraph 3, keep off all roads. Next is the machine of the International News Service, and it has just been printing a dispatch from London by Kingsbury Smith. It says, Bulletin by Kingsbury Smith, International News Service Staff Correspondent, London, May 6, INS. German sources reported today that the Allies have launched the long-awaited invasion of the continent by landing parachutists in northern France and assaulting the French coast from the air and by sea. There was absolutely no immediate confirmation that the invasion had started, either from headquarters of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied Supreme Commander in the European theater, or any other Allied quarter. And then the bulletin from Smith goes on to say Londoners and observers on the southeast coast of England said that wave upon wave of Allied air fleets, constituting the largest force of bombers and fighters ever seen crossing the English Channel, had gone out toward the French coast. Now, if you'll bear with me on this tour of the newsroom, instead of going along in the geographical way I ordinarily would go to the United Press machine, the bulletin just come in on the Associated Press, and here's what it says. New York, June 6, AP, the London radio, in a Dutch language broadcast, warned European underground workers today to report to their leaders with all speed and to be prepared for anything. Keep away from military installations, the broadcast said. Underground members, report to your trusted leaders. Act with speed. Be prepared for anything. There is bombardment in the port of Le Havre. That is the bulletin, which has just come in on the Associated Press machine. Perhaps you heard those bells ringing in the background as I was reading to you the dispatch from the INS machine, and so I tried not to trip over the cable as I rushed over to the AP machine to read you the bulletin that was coming in there. And now back to the United Press machine. That's one of the many United Press machines that we have in this office. Most of them, you know, print the same thing. We have to have a great many copies here at Columbia's news headquarters. The UP machine is next to the INS machine from which I was reading a moment ago. And here is what the UP machine is printing at the moment. The first thing my eye lights on is this. Bulletin, London, June 6th. 3:05 in the morning, UP. RAF bombers, quote, in strength, unquote, attacked occupied territory last night. It was announced today. And then, bulletin, second lead by Joseph W. Grigg, United Press staff correspondent, London, Tuesday, June 6, UP. The German Transocean and DNB agencies started broadcasting shortly after 6:30 in the morning today, European time, 12:30 a.m. Eastern War Time, totally unconfirmed reports that German warships were fighting Allied landing ships around the Seine estuary, 80 miles from the South England coast, and that Allied paratroops were being landed. 2 hours later, while the Germans continued to broadcast the report in services being to foreign stations, but not to listeners in German-dominated Europe, the Supreme Headquarters of General Eisenhower had made no comment. The AP machine has just come in with another bulletin. I've not made my way over to this side of the room again, and it says, Bulletin London, June 6 AP. The Berlin radio said today that, quote, combined British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and air are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre. Now, there have been two rather late bulletins on the Associated Press to interrupt the logical order of our tour of the newsroom to rush over to the AP machine, that's the Associated Press machine. And because they were bulletins and were the latest things coming to our newsroom, although you can hear the clattering of all the other machines in the room, I'd like to read them both to you again, just in case you hadn't quite caught them all. Here's the first one that came in at 9 minutes past 3 in the morning wartime, New York. The London radio, in a Dutch language broadcast, warned European underground workers today to report to their leaders with all speed and to be prepared for anything. The broadcast said, keep away from military installations. Underground members, report to your trusted leaders. Act with speed. Be prepared for anything. There is bombardment in the port of Le Havre. And the second bulletin, the one that came in at 3:11 in wartime, from London on the Associated Press, the Berlin radio said today that, quote, combined British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and air are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre. So there we have the latest from the Berlin radio, which has been putting out these stories, these reports from the very beginning. The latest from the Berlin radio saying that the landing stretched over the entire area from Cherbourg and Le Havre, and the latest from London, the BBC and that Dutch language broadcast saying there is bombardment in the port of Le Havre, which does not necessarily mean an invasion, as you know. Incidentally, if at any time when you, on this little tour of the newsroom, if you can pick out the sounds of the bells in the background, I'd like to explain to you that when you hear 5 bells in rapid succession, that means that one of our many machines, at least one, is notifying us with the signal of 5 bells that it has a bulletin on its service wire. Of course, if you suddenly hear all the bells go crazy at once, as if it was Christmas and New Year's all together, that would be a flash. But a flash is not as common in newsrooms as many people who do not work in news sometimes believe. Now I'm back to the United Press machine where I was in the first place before interrupting to go over to the AC. Carrying the microphone with me on this long cable, surrounded by colleagues who, most of them, got up out of bed or came in a hurry when the news came in. And the United Press has a dispatch from Washington, which says, Edward Barrett, Executive Director of Overseas Broadcasting for OWI, denies in a long-distance call from New York today that OWI was transmitting German overseas invasion reports back to Germany for German consumption. He said, we don't touch a thing unless and until it is officially announced by Allied headquarters. Well, that just tells us, in a way, something that we might have assumed in the first place, but it does give me a chance to remind you again of one circumstance that might be suspicious, and that is that the German people themselves are not getting told of these things as far as we can make out so far. These broadcasts, these German reports, if we want to call them that, are all for foreign consumption. In this case, foreign means us. And still continuing, walking about the newsroom, I now come to my colleague, Major George Fielding Elliott, who is standing in his green shirt sleeves, and the pencil is behind his ear. He's working very hard at the moment, and I think he might say something into this portable microphone if I hand it to him. Major?
Thank you, Bob. There's only one item of significance in these recent reports, and that is the fact this report that there has been a British broadcast in Dutch to the people of Holland, ordering the underground leaders, the members of the underground, to report to their trusted leaders with all speed. And adding a statement that there is bombardment in the port of Le Havre. Now, if this is a genuine report,
that fighting position
would
with some
be
firepower.
unlikely that the British would order the Dutch
The
underground
capture point is under
to
attack.
mobilize and
One of
report
our
to
fighting
their leaders
positions is
unless
sustaining
there was
fire.
some serious military operation in the wind. The statement that there is bombardment in the port of Le Havre, the word bombardment
We've lost a fighting position.
in the military technical sense means bombardment by naval vessels and not bombing by aircraft. The word
Set up a
bombing
firing
is
point
used
in
when attacked by aircraft are meant. However, this should not be accepted as confirmation of the German report until we have a great deal more to go on than this one report of a British broadcast in Dutch to the people of Holland, which may turn out to be an unconfirmed or erroneous report. Remember, we have nothing to go on yet from any source other than German, except this one report, and that is not as yet confirmed from any other source. Down here again is Bob Trout.
This is George Fielding Elliott, whom we encountered on our tour of the newsroom, which was not an unlikely circumstance.
Fighting position machine gun is in place.
Some of his latest impressions about the activities here at Columbia's newsroom at, what is it, 317 and a half almost in the morning, Eastern War Time. And now, as I am about to pass from one news machine to another to read to you a few more of the bulletins to give you an idea of what does come in on the news machines at this hour, on this kind of night, I just passed by one of the news desks at which one of our Columbia news writers is typing. Perhaps you can hear the rather hesitant pecking in the background. And I see a cable on the desk among the litter of papers, paper clips, pen and ink rulers, which reminds me that perhaps you'd like to hear about this cable. About, not quite an hour ago, we got word here in the newsroom that a cable was coming in from London. Well, naturally, all these reports that we've had so far have been coming in from the enemy, so any word from London was a welcome word and perhaps exciting word for us. We waited very eagerly to see what the cable was going to be, and when it came in, it was a cable from Edward R. Murrow in London to Paul White, the director of Columbia's news services here in New York. This is what it said. London. Paul White, Columbia Broadcasting. Report to the nation, the airplane was named, let me see now, I can hardly read it myself, it's in cablese. Report to the nation, the airplane was a new and unnamed B-17. Larry Lesser and Gene Ryder, who installed the gear in this airplane and then test flew it, christened the ship, obviously after Columbia's famous program, Report to the Nation.
Down to 100
on account of it would be the first report to the nation from this B-17 plane during a combat mission. Edward R. Murrow in London. Well, that was partly in cablese and partly with a quick translation. I trust you can understand it. Perhaps I should have explained before I started to read it to you that the cable referred to the Flying Fortress, the B-17, in which Edward R. Murrow took a trip on a combat mission last week. Was it last week? Yes, I'm rather confused here. Last week to the so-called invasion coach, broadcast from the plane while it was in flight before it had landed back at its field in England. And he had said on the air several times in his broadcast from the plane in the air that the name of the fortress was Report to the Nation. Naturally, it intrigued our interest, but we were curious to know just how this flying fortress got the name Report to the Nation. Paul White naturally asked Ed Murrow, and this was Edward Murrow's cable. It's a very pleasant cable for us to receive, but it's not exactly the kind of news from London we were expecting when we heard that a cable was coming in from London. Here's the late edition on the Berlin Bulletin that I read to you a moment ago from the Associated Press. My arm is being taken and I'm going back to the AP machine. An edition on the Bulletin, the Berlin Bulletin I read to the Associated Press. Here's the continuation of it. I trust you remember the beginning. It says, grand-scale amphibious operations are underway on a broad front between the mouth of the Seine and the estuary of the River Vire, V-I-R-E. A large number of Allied landing boats of various types and light Allied naval forces of considerable strength are taking part, Berlin said. All this is Berlin radio. This is a continuation. 6 heavy Allied warships and 20 Allied destroyers are off the mouth of the Seine. Now, those are the very latest details. They are details from the German radio. Everything that's been coming in from the German radio, as I have told you, and what I gave you then were the very latest details coming in on the Associated Press machine. They are the late details, but they are from Germany, and they are not from the Allies.
Final push!
Columbia's
Germans have 10 points left.
Report that since 1:15 this morning, Eastern War Time, that would be slightly more than 2 hours ago, Berlin radio has failed to issue any further word on the invasion of Western Europe. This is just a little slip from our listening station, which has been handed to me, and it says that the British Broadcasting Corporation has not been on the air with any further news, whatever, since 2:30 this morning.
That's it! The battle is ours!
What I just read. Now, perhaps I better speak to my colleague here, Mr. Jesse Zausmer, who's a little bit nervous with his microphone, I think, but a very capable editor indeed. I just read the bulletin on the Associated Press, Jesse, and I was just handing this note to my able shortwave listening station boys, and they say that Berlin Radio has not issued any further word, and that the BBC has not been on the air since 2:30. So where do you suppose this AP bulletin came from?
Well, Bob, I think that this AP bulletin, which is Slug London, was heard by probably the BBC in London and then sent to us through the usual channel. CBS shortwave listening probably hasn't heard it yet. Our boys and girls back in shortwave are working to get whatever they can get. I know that they're listening to the German broadcasts that are being beamed to Asia and other such spots. The thing that strikes me is that Berlin hasn't said anything yet to the German people. In other words, they're giving us the full story.
The enemy is overrunning one of our capture points.
Them than it is for us. But the German people don't know anything about it.
I always thought you'd be afraid of the microphone if you ever started, but the problem is you get it to stop once you guys started. In other words, just to wrap that up for you, the President quoting the Berlin radio, obviously came from the BBC listening station in London. They must have heard one of these German radio outfits broadcasting that. Our Columbia shortwave listening station here in New York has not heard the German radio broadcasting any additional
A
reports.
medium tank was just lost.
1:15 this morning, which was approximately 2 hours ago. So these late details that we're bringing you, which one or another of the many German-controlled radio stations in Europe are putting out, are coming from Germany and are being carried in England by the BBC monitoring service and then being cabled from England to New York. I'm back again at the INS, the International News Service. I don't quite know how it happened because I had in mind which direction I was going. But anyway, here I am back because I thought I heard particular activity on the screen. And it says London, Bulletin, London, June 6, INS. The military correspondent of the German agency, DND, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred von Olberg, today joined numerous of his colleagues in broadcasting the claims that the Allied invasion of Europe has begun. And this is what this Lieutenant Colonel Alfred von Olberg, the military correspondent of the German agency, DND, says. D-Day has gone. The invasion has begun. The tension which held the whole of Europe during the past week begins to relax with an Allied landing attempt in northern France. The second front, or better, the third front, has come into being. Well, that's the comment of the military correspondent, who's called a military expert, probably, or a military analyst, the military correspondent of the German agency, DND. Lieutenant Colonel Alfred von Olberg. That's what he says. He reports at Dateline London, and as I was just reminding you a few moments ago, that means that obviously the report was heard in London, not just in New York.
Thanks, boys, here. Sherman ready.
London, and that's how we get here in our New York. You might want to read one day's station. I see that this is the BBC in English to the Pacific at 3 o'clock, taken by Michael Short. You need everybody. This is elsewhere. As I explained to the audience moments ago, I always thought you told me you'd have microphone plugs, but I can see that that's not true at all. Well, I just demanded the board. Before I go into this, if you don't mind the informality, this is sort of a reason I would explain it. These bulletins, these matches I was reading from the scenes, now they're coming in constantly, they're being changed, additional details are being added, they're being rounded up into better shape, and the purpose of them is, the primary purpose, is that they're coming in to all the afternoon newspaper offices in the country, most of them at the moment, a good many of them are, the service they take, and these newspapers are rewriting these dispatches and getting ready to print them in their afternoon editions. Some of them are repetitions. Actually, the newspaper editorial writing staff have to work on them, and many of them, as I read them to you, do not sound to you probably like the language to which you're accustomed when you read your newspaper. But anyway, that's the primary purpose of it. They're coming in all the time. They're being edited, rewritten, analyzed, and put into roundup for the better information of the audience, our radio audience, and also newspaper readers too. Now, Now to go into the rough notes of the shortwave listening station, which was just handed to me as I was walking over here by Jesse Delmer. The BBC in English to the Pacific areas. That's the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, broadcasting from a transmitter somewhere in the British Isles and leaving the broadcast especially to Pacific areas. Broadcast at 3 a.m., that's about 27 minutes ago. And here are the rough notes in the very form in which our shortwave monitors take them down. If an item is of enough interest to be sent out, it is usually rewritten and amplified and put into a little better English. That is polished up a bit, you know. But here are the rough notes, and this is the way they sound. This gives you another insight into the way a newsroom works at news headquarters at this time. German Overseas Agency stated 2 hours ago invasion began. Le Havre, parachutes landed on Normandy Peninsula. Spokesman broadcast warning that a new phase of Allied air offensive began. German Overseas News Agency made this announcement about 2 hours ago. Early this morning, the suspected invasion began when airborne forces were landed in the area of the blank estuary, one word unintelligible. Le Havre is at present being exposed to a fierce bombardment. Now, as continue on this early morning newsroom tour through our Columbia Newsroom headquarters here in New York, I come up to Ned Calmer, who many of you heard, I hope, broadcasting his regular news program. Well, it was last night, wasn't it? Last night at 11 o'clock Eastern Wartime. Here's Mr. Calmer.
Thank you, Bob. Ned Calmer reporting, taking over from Mr. Trout temporarily. First, it might be a good idea for those who have just tuned in on this exciting night to go back over the principal facts that we know so far, all of which have been reported to us by the Germans, with the exception of a broadcast by the British Broadcasting Corporation from London in Dutch to Holland, in which the very significant fact is mentioned that the French port of Le Havre is under bombardment. Presumably that means naval bombardment, although there is no specification. Also, in case you missed the start of this broadcast, there is still no Allied confirmation of the German claim that Allied troops have landed anywhere in Western Europe. The reports were started at about 12:37 this morning with a report from London carried by the Associated Press that the German news agency Transocean had announced the Allied invasion had begun. Subsequently, the Germans have been putting out information, or what passes as information, in increasing volume, and both the Associated Press, the United Press, and now the International News Service are devoting practically all of their services to this rapidly developing story. Here's a Berlin bulletin on the Associated Press machine, just calls my attention. Berlin says that the first center of gravity in these reported military operations is Caen. I'll spell that C-A-E-N, the big city at the base of the Normandy Peninsula in France. The base of this peninsula is 75 miles across between Caen and Avranches. I'll spell that again for those of you who have taken out your maps. A-V-R-A-N-C-H-E-S. The base of this peninsula is 75 miles between Caen and Avranches, and the same distance on a line extending northward to Cherbourg at the tip. Caen itself is 120 miles west-northwest of Paris. And now, Mr. Trout, are you ready again?
Yes, Mr. Calmer, thank you very much. I not quite up on what Mr. Calmer has been reading to you from these news machines. I've now got to the Office of War Information machine, and that's one of the most interesting things that's really observable here in Columbia's newsroom this morning at 3:30. The OWI machine has been almost entirely silent while all the other machines have been hammering out their news. The OWI has put out only one report this morning which says the Romanian radio reports enemy planes over Belgrade, and that report came in at 3:01 in the morning, in other words, about half an hour ago on the OWI wire. It seems that the OWI is waiting cautiously before putting out anything on these German reports. So far, all these reports have been German. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a special announcement from the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces from London, from Colonel R. Ernest Dupuy. Go ahead, London.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The text of communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
This means invasion. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are back at Columbia's news headquarters, the newsroom in New York. I've just taken the microphone out of the studio again and back into our news headquarters. You have just heard from London Colonel R. Ernest Dupuy of the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces reading communique number 1. Everything to this point has been German reports, and communique number 1 now says, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. It is now official. The landings have begun, and at this moment, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
As you just heard from Mr. Trout, the period of doubt is at an end, and we have official announcement of the landing of Allied armies on the northern coast of France. As there's nothing to add to the very bare words of the official communique, it was to be expected that the Allied naval forces would cover the landing and would be engaged in conveying our troops to the coast of France, and that there would be strong air support. When there's any further details to give you, we'll bring them to you promptly, and we'll try to analyze them for you as well as we can within the limits of the information that we get from time to time. Now, here again is Mr. Trout.
Major George Fielding Elliott has been speaking to you, talking about the invasion. I think we can now call it that. Following the reading of the first communique, communique number 1 from SAFE. That's what we call Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces, somewhere in Great Britain. Rather strangely, you know, just before we switched to London to hear the first communique, we were making this informal tour of the Columbia newsroom, which began at 3 o'clock in the morning, 35 minutes ago. I was standing here in front of the OWI machine and telling you that while all the other news services, the UP, AP, INS, Reuters, all the rest, were sending out all these reports from Europe, you know, about the German reports, the OWI, which confines itself to official news, sends us the text of the communiques and all that sort of thing. The OWI was printing almost nothing, and since the beginning of the day, since midnight, the OWI has put on only one bulletin, or rather one dispatch of any kind, saying that the Romanian radio reports enemy planes over Belgrade. And, of course, A few moments after I said that, we switched to London so that we could hear General Dupree reading the communique. And of course, at that moment, after I came out of the studio on the OWI machine, here is what is now printed. OWI 2, meaning the second bulletin since midnight. OWI 2, flash. Supreme Headquarters announces Allies begin operations on northern coast of France. Bulletin.
Frag grenades now available for action.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces supported by strong air forces began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. 3:34 p.m. Eastern wartime in Washington. That's what the Office of War Information wire says. Still looking over the machines now in a way, it's rather speculative. The whole character of this broadcast has changed. And it did change rather abruptly, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, if you've been staying with us. Well, we started, sometime after midnight. I just about 20 minutes to 1 in the morning Eastern wartime when the Germans began putting these reports out. We were bringing you frequent reports, and then at 3 o'clock in the morning, a little more than 35 minutes ago, we took this microphone here in our studio, which adjoins the Columbia Newsroom in New York, and brought it out here to the news machines and began taking you on an informal tour to show you what a newsroom is like at this hour. And now I hear that we must go to London in a few moments. Ladies and gentlemen, for a broadcast from Columbia's correspondent Edward R. Murrow, we take you now to London.
With our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
The enemy is overrunning one of our capture points.
Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight
Ambulance
savagely.
ready for action.
But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeat in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. We've inflicted upon the Germans great defeat in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home front has given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men.
The capture point is under attack.
The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty,
line just
and
got cut
skill in
off.
battle. We will accept nothing
Rear
less
echelon
than full
troops
victory.
on the front line.
Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. This order was distributed to assault elements after their embarkation. It was read by appropriate commanders to all other troops in the Allied Expeditionary Force. I return you now to the United States.
As a matter of fact, we have to come into the studio now with this unusual arrangement so that we can hear the speaker and hear what Mr. Murrow was saying. That was Edward R. Murrow, Columbia's correspondent in London. Now we're back out in the newsroom with our launch cable, and once again, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The Allied invasion of Western Europe, as you know, has begun. Such an operation carrying hundreds of thousands of troops across water to land them on a hostile shore is one of the most dangerous of all military operations. There have been few such vast military amphibious operations in all history. Some have failed, but some have succeeded. And no such operation has ever been prepared with the thoroughness of this Allied landing on the European continent. The Allies have been getting ready for it for years. The British have been looking forward to this day ever since Dunkirk.
All
And the
sectors,
moment
ability,
the United States
now
got
ready.
into the war, our military leaders realized that the main road to the defeat of Germany lay through the occupied lands of Western Europe, and they began to plan accordingly. Our leaders have also realized that they must strike with overwhelming force. Some military operations and initial results might have little success, but in this European invasion, it might be fatal, or it would be a disastrous blow to the morale of the people of the conquered nation. So, the plans for the invasion were more complex and more complete than any that military strategists have ever had to work out before. Germany's dash across the Low Countries of France was simple in comparison. So was the German attack on Russia, vast as that operation was. The Allied landings in North Africa and in Sicily involved similar problems to this one, but they were on a far smaller scale. The opposition was much lighter. Nevertheless, the experience gained in these operations has been invaluable in planning for this one. We don't know as yet the details of the first landing operation, but usually an invasion force strikes in three ways. First comes the assault force, which is composed mainly of infantry, supported sometimes by light tanks, and usually also including assault engineers. Its job is to strike quickly, to break up initial enemy resistance, and to secure a foothold on the shore before it can land the support of bombing, fighting planes, and of naval artillery. You will remember that General Eisenhower's first communique emphasized the strong naval air support which our landing was receiving.
The enemy is overrunning one of our capture points.
How quickly these first waves can get ashore depends on the strength of the enemy's defenses and on the effectiveness of this. Those defenses are reduced by bombardment.
We take you now, in a few moments, for another broadcast to the British Isles. In a moment or two, our signal will be ready. We take you
Heavy
now to
machine gun
London.
team ready for orders.
Here is the text of a report sent to London on Herbert M. Clark of the networks of the United States. This is Herbert M. Clark in a takeoff report from a live expeditionary base. I don't have to explain what the takeoff is. When you hear this, you'll know that Allied forces have reached the gap between the bases in the United Kingdom and the coast of France. We'll be there, and we'll be there to stay as you listen. As I write this, we're in an unnamed port on an unnamed coast, one of the quirks of military security. But it's a funny thing about security. A week ago in London, I was in a state of constant irritation with security censorship. It was obvious from German reports that the Nazis knew things we knew but couldn't say. Since then, I've been living and eating and sleeping aboard the flagship of an Allied assault force, one of the several which are going to come during this most, and I find that Jerry knows less than he said he did. Since I've been here, we've had exactly one air alarm, and that's not a raid or even a determined reconnaissance. And I also find that I don't object so much to security. My loyalty and responsibility to do back home is overridden by loyalty and responsibility to the soldiers on this boat who are carrying them to the beachhead. That objective is also, for the moment, unidentifiable. The place we picked for our main landing is one Jerry hasn't figured on. And I don't want to be the one to tell him that our sector is the one where his counterattack should go. The Nazis have been badly outguessed on this whole show. He's going to be surprised by the direction of the attack, and he's going to get a shot by the pilot. The master race has fallen down again. I'm treating all this in the past tense as though it hadn't already, as though it had already happened. Maybe that's a mistake, but it's a reflection of the overwhelming confidence of the troops involved, and the confidence I've drawn from the tremendous scale of the preparation. We haven't yet moved from our anchorage, but all morning, this coastal strip has been full of movement. Ladies and gentlemen, I will digress to say that the next few sentences will be semi-numerous. That script has been censored. There are ships in the task forces which are striking, British, Canadian, and American. They range from big troop carriers and supply ships down to landing craft. Other vessels, landing craft, which makes most of the journey, piggyback on bigger ships, are in the fleet. Now I admit that I can't conceive of a fleet of ships myself, but I do know that's as far as I can see from the bridge of this ship.
Others are dotting the water thickly, and I can see about 30 square miles of water. Well, ships, I'm told, half the force. Double it, and you'll have the whole. And they're all loaded with fighting men and fighting weapons, some of them still secret. For some hours, the vanguard of our force is trying to deal with specific coastal objectives in our sector of Nazi Europe, and landing craft lumbering through a choppy sea so slowly, they must start well ahead of time to get to their assigned places at their appointed times. These ships have been moving out. I'm speaking to shore by the last available channel of communication.
300 points remaining.
Those ships soon, and I hope to be back with you before long with some harder facts. This is Herbert Clark reporting from the flagship of an Allied assault invasion force for the networks of the United States. I'm returning now to the United States.
That seems to be the quickest way to get the news to you as it's coming in so rapidly. We started this as a very informal tour about 45 minutes ago when we didn't know that it was invasion. As a matter of fact, the Germans were the only people who had been putting out the reports. And in a few moments, I'd like to sort of sum the thing up for you so we can see where we are at the moment. But it seems that the story is now at this stage at which interruptions come, things come in so quickly that it's almost impossible to find time to go back and sum up. We've had the first dispatch from London. We sometimes have to interrupt each other here during this informal broadcast. When we get word to switch rapidly to London, there are only a few seconds in which to do it, and so our broadcast may be abrupt at some point or another, but we're trying to keep you abreast of the news as quickly as possible, and so when we get word that London has something, we just cut whatever we can and go as quickly as possible. Now, I think perhaps the best way to get up to date, to bring us up to date here from the exciting moment, the supreme and moment of suspense at which Colonel Dupuy announced in London that this really was an invasion and not just a German trick. I think the best way to bring ourselves up to date is to go back to this Associated Press machine in front of which I'm standing.
Start at the copy at 3:33 a.m. in the morning. That's 1 minute after we switched to London. And here's what it says. Flash. That's a very rare thing, you know, in the news world. Flash. London, Eisenhower's headquarters announces Allies land in France. Immediately afterwards, bulletin. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, June 6 AP. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters announced today that Allied troops began landing on the northern coast of France this morning, strongly supported by naval and air forces. The text of the communique, quote, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. In 5 seconds, I hear we again will get an official report from London. Go ahead, London. This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. In a moment, you will hear the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His statement will be followed by other messages to the peoples of the countries on the western coast of Europe, which are occupied by the enemy. The Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I have a message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own
Dropped
country,
to 200 points.
the power of your liberation is approaching. All people, men and women, young and old, have a part to play in the achievement of final victory. To members of resistance movements, whether led by nationalists or by outside leaders, I say, follow the instructions you have received. To takers who are not members of organizing resistance, shall say, continue your passive resistance, but do not needlessly endanger your lives. Wait until I give you the signal to rise and fight you on. The day will come when I shall need your resistance. Until that day, I call on you for the hard fight.
There's a major reporting for action.
Citizens of France, I am proud to have again under my command the gallant forces of France. As citizens of their allies, they will play a worthy part in the liberation of their nation. Besides the initial landing that was made on the soil of your country, I speak to you with even greater emphasis my message to the peoples of other occupied countries in Western Europe. Follow the instructions of your leaders. A true sure uprising of all Western nations prevents you from being of less interest in your country during a critical hour. Be patient. Prepare.
We lost a gun crew!
There is imposed on me the duty and responsibility of taking all measures to the prosecution of the war. And then to reach the orders that I shall give you to do. The peaceful administration of France must be provided by France. All citizens carrying their present duties unless
Crowds are
otherwise
sniffing around our asses! Tactical
those
point
who
being
have made
captured!
common cause with the enemy and so betray their country will be ruined. When France is liberated from her oppression, you yourself will choose your representatives and the government under which you wish to live. In the course of this campaign for the final defeat, the enemy will make sustained further loss and damage. Tragic though they may be, they are part of the fight against it. As still, all my power to motivate your heart. I know that I can count on your steadfast achievement, no less than in the past. For the heroic deeds of Frenchmen who have continued to struggle against the Nazis and their vicious allies, in France and throughout the French Empire, have been an example and an inspiration to all of us. What do you mean that the European phase of the campaign?
Friendly's down to 100 points. I say again, allies at 100 points.
Love freedom, stand with us now. Keep your faith strong. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
You have just heard the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
It is just the announcement that General de Gaulle has arrived in England. It is your constant message to the
We're
people
getting the
of
hell
France.
beat out of us. We got 75 points remaining.
You will look here at the King of Norway. His Majesty King Håkon II. Landsmenn, som del i den store partisektan, som har taget sigte på frigjøringen af Europa under krigsfolk. Krigen har det, der går en lille fase.
Consolidate our forces. We're left with 50 points.
Taknemmelighed og glæde, fordi den indbærer vidtheden om, at de allierede styrker nu har ført os et godt stykke længere frem på vejen mod sejren på frihed. I glæden over denne udvikling må et spørgsmål gå til nogen forhastet eller uoverlagt handling. Men i tiden fremover siger det, at den endnu større betydning end før og lægge gennem alle konflikter til denne til vejen. Det man ser på en slutmål. Ikke ved i forsigtighed udleverer sig selv eller andre. Medlemmerne af flere organisationer, som samarbejder med det allierede militære autoriteter, står i styrken.
Pull everyone back.
Du har
We're down to 10
dine
points.
bestemte opgaver at løse, og det er på 4 år. Det er det tilfælde musik, og noget kan være tidligt. Eller
Krauts just handed our ass to us. Pull back, all forces, pull back.
Kommer til at yde en ny værdifuld indsats i friheden. Jeg og min regering sender en varm hilsen til alle landsmænd, som står rank på sin krop, og som er frivillige og bevidstfuldt går frem med stadig mere krævende opgave. Du er allierede styrkes overkommandering. Det er kommanderet til om vejledningscenter af alle, som står under hans kommando. Og denne kontakt eller på anden måde det er vokset, vigtigt og gav kontakt med udenrigskommunikationen
New Zealand, New Station, the military duty, or the Buddhism, and Islamic faith. You do. At the influence of Christian justice, or these laws, of the outer witness. Action. Welcome. For their faith. Neither is there more than I, neither is there. Where is the translation of the woman?
Liberating the oppressed people of Europe.
The war in the West has today entered a new phase. We have all received this news with a profound feeling of joy and satisfaction. As we realize that our forces are thereby carried out a good way further on the road to victory. Heartened by these developments, our people must not allow their enthusiasm to lead them into premature or unpremeditated acts. From now on, however, it is even greater importance than heretofore to hinder and confuse the enemy by all subtle and covert means that cannot expose yourself or others. It does not apply to organized resistance groups who are in touch with the Allied military authorities. They have been given their special orders, and they will receive further orders. These they will carry out in the knowledge that if they are in need of a hiding place, or food, or any other help, they will always find it. In this way also many of you will be able quietly to take an effective part in the battle for freedom. I and my government warmly salute all compatriots who stand firm at their posts and to look forward to ever more exacting tasks in a spirit of self-sacrifice and confidence. The Supreme Allied Commander will at all times keep you informed about what is expected of everyone under his command. And over the radio and by other means, our people will continue to be in close contact with their constitutional authorities. We salute the forces which have now gone into battle. Our thoughts and warmest wishes go with them. We know that they will not fail us, and we promise never to fail them. Fellow countrymen, keep together and be prepared. Long live the cause of the United Nations. Long live the cause of freedom. That ends the translation of King Hawkins' statement.
Upgrade completed.
Communique number 1, issued by Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, will now be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. We will have on the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, His Excellency, Professor Herbrandy. Mannen en vrouwen van Nederland. Nu het grote ogenblik gekomen is waarop het met oude spreekkrachten dat er machtigen aanval zijn overgegaan vanuit het westen, heb ik enkele zeer ernstige woorden tot u te zeggen. Ik verzoek u hiernaar met de grootst mogelijke aandacht te luisteren en mijn woorden met afneming van alle noodzakelijke veiligheidsmaatregelen door te geven aan de betrouwbare landgenoten die niet in de gelegenheid waren naar mij te luisteren. Landgenoten, nu de geallieerde motorvlagmeerkomst op Hitler's Atlantic Wall gaat door ons allen een siddering van ontroering. Onze mannen van leger, vloot, luchtmacht en koopvaardij hebben de taak te vervullen welke aan hen door de militaire opperbevelhebber is toebedeeld. In de harten van ons allen stijgt de dringende bezig op God en Almachtige om hulp en bijstand in deze vooral een rechtvaardige strijd. In nauw overleg met met de geallieerden opperbevelhebber geeft u daarom de volgende orde, waaraan ik verwacht dat iedere Nederlander die van goede willen is, zich kan helpen. Mijn orde richten zich niet tot die speciale gevechtsgroepen die hun eigen orders hebben ontvangen en daaraan gevallen zullen geven. Ik richt mijn instructies op hen die niet lid zijn aan die speciale gevechtsgroepen. 1. U zult 10 dagen van gelandkundig tegen het gevecht geven. Het zou den reden vijand slechts de gelegenheid bieden represailles te nemen, tegen en veelvoudiger van u te worden. 2. Wij die redeneren dat de vijanden hun leven vrij hebben en zich dus niet willen laten weerhouden van iedere vorm van directe hulpverlening, zullen we vastgebonden dat er represailles zich zouden uitsprekken tegen goede, algoede, onschuldigen. Deze stellingen dan. Het herhaalde het plan, geen gewelddadig, openlijk verzet. 3. We waren tegen multitude niet is, overal waar onzichtbaar en onherkenbaar actief gevecht wordt, met een onverbiddelijke geboden. 4. Daarna dient hij alles na te laten wat een vijand van enig direct of indirect voordeel zou kunnen zijn. Hij heeft enkel middel te zijn om u te provoceren of te misleiden. Dus overal dat hij paard te verleden. Luister alleen naar de aanwijzingen die wij hieruit brengen. 6. Een krachtiger actie was verwacht, zal dit op een onweerstaanbare wijze en hieruit worden waargenomen. Nederlanders, dit met ons om te geven. Hele het vaderland.
Here is the translation of the statement brought to me by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Men and women of the Netherlands. Now is the great moment for the right, and the Allied forces have started a mighty attack on the road. I have some very solemn words to say to you. I repeat to you with the greatest possible approach, and with due observance of all necessary security measures, to pass on my words to trustworthy compatriots who have not been in a position to listen to me. Fellow countrymen, now that the Allied sledgehammer blow is falling on Hitler's Atlantic wall, we are all filled with emotion. Our men of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the National Navy have to fulfill the task allotted to them by the military commander-in-chief. In the hearts of all of us rises the urgent prayer to the Almighty for help and assistance in what is for us so righteous a struggle. In close deliberation with the Allied High Command, I therefore give you the following order, which I expect every Dutchman of goodwill to take. These orders do not apply to those organized resistance groups who have received their orders and who will obey them. It is to those who are not members of organized resistance groups that I address these instructions. 1. You will not perpetrate any acts of violent open resistance. It would only offer the cruel enemy an opportunity to take far bloodier reprisals than ever
Sherman
before.
ready.
2. Those who reason that they are ready to sacrifice their life and therefore do not wish to refrain from any form of direct assistance are urged to consider that the reprisals would extend to a great many innocent people who know the death. And I therefore request, with emphasis, no violent open resistance. This, however, must be done. Wherever invisible and unrecognizable acts
active resistance which must be inexorably forthcoming. Player company X must be of any direct or indirect advantage. The enemy will not fail to employ any means of provoking or defeating. Wherever you go, wherever you may be, watch your own behavior. Listen, all of you, to the instructions which we give you from here. As soon as more forceful action is required of you, this will be made clear from here in unmistakable fashion. That will stay with us to the full. Long live the father. That ends the translation of the statement made by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. The Prime Minister of Belgium, His Excellency Monsieur Hubert Poiret. Mes chers compatriotes, l'heure attendue par vous est proche. Les opérations préliminaires pour la libération de l'Europe vont commencer. Cet assaut initial est l'annonce certaine de votre délivrance. Vous allez vivre des jours difficiles, dans une attente anxieuse. C'est le moment de montrer une fois de plus les qualités de discipline et de maîtrise de vous-même dont vous avez donné tant d'exemples de cette capacité. La première règle à suivre est de laborieux de conscience. De ne pas vous laisser tromper par l'anticipation perfide de vos de ne pas vous laisser enfermer dans des actions prématurées qui ne pourraient avoir pour résultat que de terribles représailles. Les alliés vous sont reconnaissants de la magnifique résistance que vous avez montrée sous l'oppression allemande, et le gouvernement est convaincu que vous ferez tout ce qui est possible pour contribuer à détraquer la machine de guerre de l'ennemi. Le succès final de l'effort militaire aujourd'hui commencé dépend en grande partie de la force que vous conserverez pour le moment décisif. Vous souhaiteriez que nous vous demandions tout de suite tout l'effort dont vous êtes capable. Mais une résistance organisée, déjà en possession de ces consignes, et le sabotage clandestin sont maintenant plus utiles. À tous les patriotes, je dis, obéissez avec une discipline complète à tous les ordres qui vous sont donnés par le commandement suprême allié et par votre gouvernement. Mais soyez attentifs à discerner les fausses consignes qui pourraient être lancées par l'ennemi. Ne croyez pas les rumeurs non contrôlées. La seule façon de vérifier l'authenticité des nouvelles est de vous assurer qu'elles sont transmises par les principes de télégraphie scientifique des alliés. Par-dessus tout, méfiez-vous des agents provocateurs. Le moment du suprême combat n'est pas encore venu. Lorsqu'il est sonné, vous en faites avertir sur le commandement appuyé du fond de votre gouvernement. On vous dira alors, clairement, sans récit, utilisez cette période intermédiaire pour perfectionner vos organisations afin qu'au moment voulu, leur action soit pleinement efficace. Dans les différences, nous marquerons peut-être la dernière phase de la guerre où les Belges devront plus que jamais montrer un mutuel dévouement et toute la recherche encore disponible de plus exposés. Et nos Belges que nous vous envoyons sont courage, discipline, solidarité, confiance. There is a translation of the statement just made by the Prime Minister of Belgium. My beloved countrymen, the honor so long awaited by you is here. Preliminary operations for the liberation of Europe have begun. This first assault is the certain signal for you to deliver us. You are going to undergo a difficult phase and a period of anxious waiting. This is the time to show once again those qualities of discipline and self-control which for 4 years you have so often displayed. The first rule for you to follow is to moderate provocation. The second is not to let yourselves be fooled by any of the enemy's treacherous provocations. And not to let yourselves be embroiled in any premature action which could result in terrible reprisals. This that you have shown under German. And the government is convinced that you will do everything possible to contribute to the overthrow of the German war machine. The final success of the military undertaking which began today depends largely on the strength that you can show for the decisive moment. You naturally want us to demand of you immediately all the effort of which you are capable. But the organized resistance, which already has its orders, and clandestine sabotage are at this moment of more use. To all patriots, I say, obey with complete discipline all the orders given you by the Supreme Allied Command and by your government. But be on the alert for false orders, which might be issued by the enemy. Do not believe uncontrolled rumors. The only way to check the genuineness of any news is to make sure it is different from Allied radio stations. Above all, trust agent provocateur. The moment of supreme combat has not yet come. When it does, you will be warned of it by the Allied command and by your government. You will then be clearly told what is expected of you. Use the period that intervenes to perfect your organization, so that at the desired moment, their action may be fully effective. In the increased suffering, which perhaps will mark the last phase of the war, all Belgians must, more than ever before, strengthen the agency together and use all resources still available to relieve the suffering of those most sorely tried. The watchwords we send you are courage, discipline, unity, and confidence. That ends the translation of the Belgian Prime Minister's statement. Communique number 1. Issued from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This concludes the broadcast from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. And overseas service of the Union Army. Once again, this is Columbia's newsroom in New York City. We are continuing, naturally, our coverage of the invasion. We're going to the broadcast in London. I must tell you now that we are to pause for a 15-second station identification break, but this is warning to all our stations on the network that we are going to pause only for 15 seconds, and after that we are going to have another broadcast from overseas. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. Once again, this is Columbia we are continuing our coverage of the invasion, which, as you know, has now officially begun. That long broadcast we had was came directly from England, not from London. It came from somewhere in England.
A medium tank was just lost.
Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, which are familiarly known as STATE. Now, we just paused for station identification, and in a few moments, we are to bring you another broadcast from Britain. The broadcast is coming in so quickly, the details are moving so swiftly that we don't get time to stop and sum up the situation and tell you just where we are, but I'm sure if you were with us for any length of time, you can see just where we are. The invasion is official. The express communique has been issued from headquarters in England. We have heard from England General Eisenhower's message to the people of Europe, and then King Håkon of Norway spoke, followed by a translation in English. Then we heard the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. That was translated, and then the Prime Minister of Belgium and his speech was translated also. And then we heard, once again,
the communique number one read over again. We started this particular broadcast. Columbia's been broadcasting all evening off and on these special news programs. We started this particular broadcast about an hour and 16 minutes ago at 3 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Wartime here in New York. And as we were talking, reading the bulletins that were coming in on the news machines, at exactly 3:32 Eastern Wartime, the word came to go to England. We switched to England as we heard Colonel Dupuy at Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces reading communique number one saying that the landings have begun. Then we came back to New York and we switched to London again very quickly. Heard Columbia's correspondent in London, Edward R. Murrow, reading an order of the day. And then we came back to New York. And then we switched once again to London for this last rather lengthy broadcast from Allied headquarters. General Eisenhower's message to the people of Europe, King Hakon's speech, Prime Minister of the Netherlands speech, the Prime Minister of Belgium's speech. Now, in a few moments, we will go again to London. We don't know exactly just what it's going to be at this particular moment, but we're going to go to England to bring you another one of the broadcasts in the story which is moving very swiftly now. We are going to hear from Wright Bryan, who is representing the combined American network in London.
Looks like we're getting into the...
This is Wright Bryan speaking from London. In the first hour of D-Day by British double summer time, or a little more than an hour before D-Day began by Greenwich Mean Time, the first spearhead of Allied forces for the liberation of Europe landed by parachute in northern France. In the navigator's dome in the flight deck of the C-47, I rode across the English Channel with the first group of planes from Troop Carrier Command to take our fighting men into Europe. Before we left French soil for the return trip to England, I watched from the rear door of our plane, named the Sweetie, as 17 American paratroopers, led by Lieutenant Kearney, with their arms, ammunition, and equipment into German-occupied France. Our group, at the head of the leading wing of the U.S. 9th Air Force's Troop Carrier Command, met with only scattering small arms fire from the field, was dark and quiet as we headed enemy territory. As we headed back towards the English coast, we saw traces arcing through the air behind us, a steady parade of Allied planes moving out over the course we had just navigated, strengthening the ground forces below. When we scanned below us, we could see a few ships, but could not be certain whether they were part of the Armada, carrying Allied soldiers to pieces, or tanks which were quickly following the first plans of the airborne troops which I had. For 2 days I had been living with the Troop Carrier Squadron commanded by Major Clement G. Richardson of Salinas, California. His combat crews had been fully briefed as to their initial missions, the course they would fly, and all procedures they would follow. The moment this briefing began, the combat crews lived apart from the ground personnel at their base, with barbed wire surrounding their quarters, and guards protecting them from any contact with outside persons. All they did is they watched the weather. After an early supper, they break up into small groups for volleyball games in a small recreation area. In the early evening, Major Richardson returned to the conference with Lieutenant Colonel Donaldson of Birmingham, Alabama, commanding this lead group. Major Richardson came within the barbed wire and closed to his own flight.
Let's get our boys some covering smoke.
Blast on his weapon. Pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and clustered around. Coming to the briefing room, well, we stood in front of a large
support is here. Sherman ready.
course was flying. Quickly as his men were all in the room, Major Richardson said, "Do you know your stuff?" There was no one of dissent taken. Major Richardson said, "Get your stuff and report to the operations room immediately. I'm going down to the colonel to get the weather report. I think this is it. Good luck." The crews began to file out of the room. Major Richardson stopped. "You want to get back, don't you?" he asked. There was a quick murmur of consent. Then Danny came there and fired. Crews piled in their thrusters, go first to the operations office, and then to the line where their planes were drawn up and ready to go. As they moved towards the airport proper, they passed long columns of airborne troops, trudging slowly under their battle equipment from the bivouac area where they had been camped awaiting this day towards the planes which would carry them into battle. General Eisenhower had visited this camp during the afternoon, quietly standing among the men and chatting with them, asking them names and their homes and their jobs. Outside the door of each 347, soldiers assembled and checked their equipment, while ground crews and combat crews gave the planes the final tuning up. heavily laden transport planes began taxiing along long procession toward the runway. As the first squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David Daniel of Birmingham, Alabama, began to take off, the planes racing in swift succession down the runway, Lieutenant General Louis Expierience, the 9th Air Force commander, moved up and down the line of planes, giving the thumbs up sign and cruise. Meantime, the paratroopers had adjusted their packs, donned their main wetsuit suits, and climbed into the plane. Each was so heavily loaded that he had to be pushed from behind and pulled from above to get up to step into the plane. In our plane, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of San Antonio, Texas, the senior officer aboard, moved quietly up and down the passenger compartment, talking to each man and asking if he had everything he needed. As the men settled in their bucket seats, Colonel Cole said, "The doc is going to give you some pills to guard against airsick. Make yourselves as comfortable as you can. Better try to sleep a little." Quiet settled in the plane. These men had done their talking. Now they were grim and silent. The soldier sitting farthest forward on the port side, Private Robert C. Hillman of Manchester, Connecticut, said, "I know my shoot's okay because my mother checked it. She works in the Pioneer Parachute Company in our town, and her job is giving the final once-over to all shoots they manufacture." On the flight deck of our plane, Lieutenant John E. Peters of Chicago, the pilot, and Lieutenant T.E. Maxwell of Clay of Michigan uttered soft curses as their motors were slow to start after a long pause on the taxi trip. But when the engines did turn over, they droned steadily and powerfully. Almost before we knew it, we were trundling along past the operations building to the control tower, where all the ground personnel at the base were standing. Some held thumbs up, some made the V sign, some waved. It was like the takeoff of a big mission for a bomber station, only more so. This was the first combat mission for this outfit, and everyone on the base knew that this was the day. Our ship was leading the second section of the second squadron in the first group. We picked up speed on the long runway. I stood between the pilot and co-pilot and watched the formation lights of the ships ahead of us slowly,
We just lost a
almost
medium
imperceptibly
tank.
climbing, then gradually swinging into wide circles. This thing was really loaded down at the pilot seat, and as we became airborne, you could almost feel the sturdy transport strengthening its muscles and shouldering its burden. Then, foot by foot, almost inch by inch, rising above the fields and trees of southern England. As our squadron fell into its formation, 3 ships each in the first section, 3 V's and 3 ships each in the second section, which we were leading. The preceding squadron was already circling the home field, now gaining altitude more rapidly. Other squadrons followed. Soon the entire group was in the air. All about us and below us was such a glimmering fabric of light as I had not seen in the 8 months I had been in blacked-out England. 4 times we circled the field, its runways and perimeter outlined in sparkling white lights. Through the sky, formation lights of the planes strung out almost to the limit of vision, looking for all the world like holiday decorations stretching down the length of any American main street. As the long procession straightened out on its pre-established course toward the shore of the English Channel, signal lights blinked. Navigators checked their speed and direction with the pilot and began their continuous plotting of position. As we headed toward the coast, bulky transports silhouetted against the skies, they gently undulated in the prompt watch of their companions. Reaching the first point for change of course, our plane blinked its signal light, and Pete said to his co-pilot, "Want to take it now, Maxie?" And Maxie took over the controls. "Right on course, and we're 1 minute early," reported Navigator Robert E. Taylor of Altoona, Pennsylvania. At that moment, I left the glass blister in the forward roof of the fuselage, sometimes called the astral globe, sometimes called the navigating dome, from which I had been watching the formations about me. Too fascinated to feel the weight of the flak suit, which, like all crew members, I was wearing, or the steel helmet which I was pressing against the ceiling. Down the long passenger cabin, I walked to see how the paratroopers were riding. More than half of them had taken their colonel's advice and were dozing with their heads back against the wall and their feet stretched out in front of them. The others were sitting silently, except for 2 or 3 who talked among themselves in whispers. By the open rear door, Colonel Cole waited and said, "It's cold back here with the wind whipping in." I had been perspiring in the cruise cabin up front. Back where the colonel sat, I was glad I wore heavy clothing. Four signal lights blinked as we crossed the coast of England and pushed out across the channel. The sea was calm, its steely grayness blending in the half-light with the dingier gray of the horizon. But soon the moon brightened the water and made the ripples below us twinkle.
Just to identify the speaker for you, ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Wright Bryant, representing the combined Allied network, speaking to us from Allied headquarters in England and giving us a description of the takeoff of the airborne troops from the field from which they took off, armed the invasion of the continent. And now back to the voice of Wright Bryant.
We had not seen a plane outside our own formation. The fighters must have done their work well, for there was no sign of enemy aircraft about. Tiny, tell the colonel it's 30 minutes into a jump bomb, yelled Pilot Chief. And the fat husky crew chief, Staff Sergeant Richard A. Everly of Indianapolis, his father is a major in the Air Corps, shouldered his way back to give the word to Colonel Cole. And then, turning my eyes from the occasional lights and flares which flowed on the Channel Island, I looked straight ahead and caught my first glimpse of the coast of France. I had never visited the continent of Europe in peacetime, and I was waiting for invasion day to visit it in wartime. The pilot and the co-pilot, too, were seeing this coast for the first time. None of us spoke, but each looked at the other.
Momentarily, we interrupt the system of Wright Bryant being broadcast from the British Isles to give you this bulletin that's come in on the International News Service here in New York. It says, at 4:10 a.m. wartime today, German broadcast reported fighting between German and Allied troops 10 miles inland from the coast of Normandy. DNP said that Allied troops had been reinforced at the mouth of the Seine at dawn. You must remember that this is a German broadcast which is reported by INS, but it is the first word of any fighting inland at all, and this German broadcast says 10 miles inland. Now we return to the description of Wright Bryant speaking from the team headquarters in England.
Small fields looked peaceful with their orderly hedgerows. It almost seemed you could see the furrows. Now the paratroopers were on their feet, each adjusting his packs and snapping his ripcord over the static line, a cable which ran along the center of the cabin ceiling so that each chute would open automatically as its wearer jumped through the door. "You all set?" asked the colonel. "Get this thing hooked for me," he said, as he took his own place closest to the door. The jump lights, a small bank of signal lamps, were gleaming beside the door. They blinked as the pilot threw his switch. Before I could look up, they began jumping. I wanted to know how long it would take the 18 men to jump. I tried to count 101, 102, 103 to estimate the number of seconds. Before I had counted to 10 seconds, it may have been 11 or 12, but no more, our passengers had left us, all but one of them. Paratroopers shoved each other so swiftly and heavily towards the open door that they jolted against the doorframe.
Sherman ready.
One man among the last half dozen hit the rear of the door so heavily that he was thrown into the back of the cabin and dazed. The men behind shoved him aside and went on jumping. Before the unhappy soldier could get to his feet, our plane was well past the drop zone. In a matter of minutes, it was back over the water and setting a course for home. It was too late. That soldier had to return with us. He was unconsolable. He thought his comrades might think him yellow. The plane crew assured him that they would think no such thing, but he sat moody and glum all the way back and appealed for lonely instructions when he returned. As soon as I had watched the jump from the rear door, I ran back to the front of the ship and looked straight back from the glass dome. Tiny streams of tracer bullets were curving upward from the ground, but they were well behind us. One of the pilots in our squadron had unwittingly left on his formation light, and the tracers came closest to his wingtip. But we saw nothing that looked like heavy action, except in the far distance. Our course had been well plotted and navigated to avoid the known German batteries. We were over France only 11 minutes. With our ships lightened by unloading their cargo, we picked up speed and streaked for home. Behind us, we could still see the tracers and an occasional flyer. Below, a few more ships, but we couldn't tell just what they were. The Battle of Europe had begun, and our squadron had delivered the first Allied ship soldiers to their scene of action. This is Wright Bryant. This is Wright Bryan in London returning you to New York.
Once again, this is Columbia's newsroom in New York. Our studio adjoining the newsroom to be exact. About South speaking, you've been listening to Wright Bryan, who represents the combined Allied network that has been speaking to us from space, that's the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, with a description of the takeoff of the first airborne troops to leave the field to take part in this invasion. Now, there's so much to tell you to bring you up to date, and it's a little bit difficult to tell just when we are going to get to London again. A good many broadcasts are coming in from the British Isles. As you can tell, if you've been with us at all since about 3:30 this morning, when we first communicated with it's 3:32 in wartime exactly, from London as a matter of fact. It's just difficult to tell when we're going to switch back and how much of the stories we should tell you here, from here at the moment. Columbia's military analyst, Major George Stephen Elliott, has two things that he's been waiting to say during the time when we've been listening to these broadcasts from London. One of them, from England rather, we don't know whether that's from London. One of them I know concerning the assistance in the invasion of General Montgomery. That's right, isn't it, Major Elliott?
That's right. We have a communique here to the effect that General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery of the British Army, whom you'll remember as the famed commander of the 8th Army during the fighting in North Africa, is commanding the Army group carrying out the attack on the French coast, which is announced today. Our Army group is a very large organization consisting of 2 or more armies. And it is further stated that General Montgomery's Army group includes American, Canadian, and British forces. We did not suppose that this is the only Army group which will be landed on the coast of Europe eventually. This is just the first such organization to land. Remember, it's a very, very large force, including at least 2 armies under the combined command of General Montgomery. Now, I'd like to call your attention to something in Mr. Park's report, which you heard earlier, in which he pointed out that the Germans will be surprised by the direction and shocked by the timing of the attack. That indicates that the Allies expect to surprise the Germans when the main attack develops. Now, what happened before we are finally able to determine where the main attack is being delivered may, of course, be a feint intended to defeat the enemy. It's interesting to note that one of Montgomery's opponents will be his old enemy, North Africa, Marshal Rommel. Marshal Rommel is not the chief commander of the German anti-invasion forces. The chief commander of those forces is Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, who is a very experienced officer. He's 69 years of age, but he's considered one of the ablest officers in the German army. It is believed that Marshal Rommel commands the Mobile counterattack forces under Marshal von Rundstedt's general command. The weather over the channel is reported to be bright and clear with moderate sea and occasional gust of wind. There are some low-hanging clouds in some areas, which may occasion some difficulty to our area. The Germans report that the American troops reinforced strong at the mouth of the Thames by shooting air. This might suggest that our main objective is the Hague. There's also another German report. Remember, this is a German report and not confirmed from an Allied source. It says that American forces are penetrating towards the town of Caen. It does not say whether these are troops landing on the beach, pushing inland towards Caen, which is about 7.5 miles from the coast, and so controls the main railway to the town of Turbin. It's further stated that Allied battleships, monitors, and cruisers bombarding the coast defenses at long range, and that other craft, destroyers, small craft, closer in, covered the landing of our forces landing on the beaches. But apparently, the parachutists and airborne troops were the first to deliver the blow, as you just heard from Mr. Wright Bryan. These were apparently the first foot soldiers to land on the soil of France with parachutes. And you remember that he referred to long columns of airborne troops marching up to the takeoff station, which suggests that the airborne troops, that is, airborne infantry, perhaps carrying fighters or troop-carrying planes, are going to follow up the efforts of the parachutists as soon as the parachutists have obtained fields on which the transport planes and gliders can land. It's reported that these forces are being opposed by German shock troops. Another German report. And you will remember that the Germans have been boasting some time of a special organization, special shock troop detachment, which have been organized to fight the expected arrival of Allied airborne troops. That is a summary of the military situation as far as we have it now. And now, here once again, is Bob Trout.
Major George Feeling Elliott, Columbia's military analyst, and now the Columbia's newsroom has been filled some time ago, and we began schedule on that informal tour of the newsroom that suddenly developed into the invasion while we were actually watching the scene. At that time, I believe there were about 25 people actively working in our newsroom at top speed, and now they turned up as complete. Among other arrivals who've been here for the last hour or two is Columbia's war correspondent, Quentin Reynolds, whom you've all heard many times. He saw the invasion of Palermo, he saw the invasion of Sicily, that's the capital of chronologically, I should say he saw the invasion of Sicily, the invasion of Palermo, and he was at the maneuver, the landing at Dieppe, which is near the present fighting as far as we can tell. And now here is Quentin Reynolds.
The words of the communique announcing the landings were brief and cold and tactful. We don't know how many men landed on enemy territory. We don't know how many places they landed. We don't know whether their trip across the water was a hard one, constantly hampered by German aircraft. We only know that last night one man came to his word. Eisenhower said, let's go, the invasion was on. There are 1,000 stories behind the short communique which merely told us that our men had landed. Those of us who have been on other amphibious landings, imagine how our men felt last night. They were finally told that their long months of waiting were over. As long as these men live, even if they're sick, will always be to them the night before Tuesday. If they live to be 100, the instant will forever be D-Day to them. Back to Bob South.
But now we will hear a broadcast from John W. Vandercook, who is representing all networks, and will speak to us in London. Go ahead, London.
This is John W. Vandercook in London. The announcement is just been made. The invasion of Western Europe has begun. The States and the Persians promised by Winston Churchill and hinted at by the military experts have now been relegated to the limbo of dead world. 4 million people will say today, this is their end. This is the across the board. The actual numbers of planes the week past from pulverizing rod by rod and star by star. Every German position from Italy to the clean and shallow water to powered and land flat. And now with troops across the port, then followed by the paratroopers. From Italy to the clean and shallow water to powered and land flat. And now with troops across the port, then followed by the paratroopers, landing boats, the infantry. Newport is a narrow track. By all present indications, General Eisenhower and his field commander, the great Montgomery of Eastern North Africa, have attacked along miles of the French coast. The textbook pattern of invasion, this of course is the most massive such operation in all human history, calls for the early possession by the attacker of good seaports. The purpose of that is clear. A naval offensive against the enemy-held coast requires swiftly after its commencement the possession by the initiator of the attack of harbors full of men loading of far weightier materiel and can be put ashore even by the incredibly versatile and numerous amphibian landing craft. That is probably an essential part of the Allied plan, as it is now being put in practice. Be sure of it, we are moving with the weight of lawlessness. In the order of the day issued to each man in the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight Eisenhower calls this mighty mission the Great Crusade. He adds the eyes of the world of the fight, the hopes and prayers of millions of people everywhere march with you. General Eisenhower, solemn promise. Company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts will bring about the destruction of the German war mission, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the French people of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. And the supreme commander war. The enemy will fight savage. He is well trained, well equipped, and battle hard. Final words of the general's orders have been lived to the disheartening has raised every heart. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all
also seeks the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. American, British, and Canadian forces under the direct command of General Bernard Elman are carrying out the first gigantic phase of the attack. The skies are ahum with the ceaseless passage of great planes that shuttle smoothly back and forth from the paltry airfields of east. The scene of battle almost within eyesight of the British shore. English ports that pouring cornucopias, the long-garnered riches of men and war machines that have assembled for these many, many months for this long-awaited hour. And I turn you now to New York.
And we are now back in Columbia's news headquarters, the studio adjoining our newsroom in New York City. Bob Duff speaking once again. We just heard John W. Vandercook speaking from Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces somewhere in Great Britain. Mr. Vandercook is representing the combined Allied network. We are very sorry to have to interrupt Mr. Reynolds before switching very rapidly to get the broadcast from London, but as you can tell, if you're staying with us on this invasion broadcast, and it's happening very rapidly, we've got about 30 seconds notice, sometimes less than that someone in London is ready with another report, and we have to switch very rapidly. Now, if Mr. Reynolds doesn't mind taking up again at the point at which he was, I'd like to turn the microphone back to Quentin Reynolds.
As I said, the details so far have been rather scanty, but there are a few things we do know. We do know that the weather was perfect for the attempt. The tides were right, and the moon rose high above the channel. It was a full moon and a cloudless sky. It was a kind of moon that kept its light for the grandeur of its own height, so that the amazing sea merged with the dark blue of the channel water. Safe from the prying eyes of the German night fighters, the east had maintained the vision over the tracks over the North Sea. But our AF bullfighters and American pilots, the same we used to call the BB-7,
Rear echelon troops on the front line.
taking these reconnaissance planes to such height, their value as observers is almost nullified. Even on the clearest night, you can't see much from 20,000 feet. And blacked out ships with flame dancers hiding the red glow of their smokestack are very difficult to spot. These communications received so far do not tell of the prayers that have been up to thousands and thousands of our men. They slid through the dangerous, uncharted minefields of the channel, the post-enemy territory. The communiques do not tell us of the feeling of tension that gripped the entire invasion. A feeling that grew and grew, that fought in their throat and the threat that choked you. The communiques do not tell of how men clutched their Tommy guns and fingered their carbines, preparing for the cold, though the weather was warm. The communiques don't tell us of the stomachs of tightening, the fear that always comes before the hour of action. There's always like that. The communique only tells us that the waiting is over. The real showdown is to come. Spirits home during these lonely early morning hours can do nothing. Nothing but hope and pray and have faith in these fighting men of ours. Now I return you to Bob South.
Columbia's war correspondent, Quentin Reynolds, who, among the many military operations he has covered, was at Kiev, which was a landing, a one-day landing, if you remember, somewhere in the vicinity of the fighting that's going on in Turkey as far as we can tell. Now, the papers are piling up here in our studio adjoining the newsroom, separated from it by a glass wall here at Columbia's news headquarters in New York. It's a little difficult to tell where to begin bringing you up to date most rapidly. Perhaps you heard a few moments ago, I lost track of how long ago it was, perhaps you heard the INS report that came from London and which said that the INS, the German broadcast, reporting fighting between German and Allied troops 10 miles inland from the coast of Normandy. That was a German report from the German agency TND, reported by INS from London, and I would like to point out at this time, in case you heard it, that even if by some chance the German broadcast could be true, it does not necessarily mean a penetration. It could mean fighting between Germans and some of these airborne troops and parachutists we have been hearing about. Here is a one-line dispatch that's been handed me. It's from the British news agency Lawyer from London, and it says, the German news agency TND says today that Allied airborne landings have been made in Normandy in great depth. That's what we're talking about. Time to brief Reuters dispatch is handed to me. I'd like to repeat it again because it may be very important as this fighting goes on. The German news agency TND has as reported by Reuters, says that Allied airborne landings have been made in Normandy in great depth. We don't know whether it's true or not. It's a German report, but it may help us to follow the fighting a little bit more intelligently and more carefully as it goes along, as we remember that all reports about fighting inland do not necessarily mean penetration. Now, it's a bit difficult to decide what to start into, because once again we've just got signal that we are about to switch the air across the ocean once again, and to bring you a broadcast from the British Isles, once again a broadcast from space. You might as well remember that word. We'll be hearing a great deal of it. And so now to Jim Willard in London.
This is James Willard, speaking from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. I have just seen the first American troops preparing to storm ashore onto the continent of Europe. They were about to land on the north coast of France at 6:30 British Standard Time this morning. At 6:23, the Marauder bomber in which I was riding dropped the last load of bombs to be launched onto the coastal targets before H hour a few minutes later, when our landing barges would strike the shore. All night and from dawn onwards, thousands of Allied planes have been softening up a strip of coast. Already several thousand paratroopers are waiting further inland to join forces with the landing parties. These airborne troops were flown in last night. I could see evidence of the landings in a number of parachutes lying in the little fields. But I must say at once, the amazing feature of my flight this morning was the almost unbelievable quietness of the scene below, where in the next few days, maybe in the next few hours, decisive battles for the reconquest of Europe will be fought. For with the exception of German tanks, which are moving up the roads towards the beachhead or hiding in hedges, we saw no signs of enemy resistance. As our flight of 54 Marauders made their bomb run along the enemy coast, we were met by only a few puffs of inaccurate flak, and by machine gun fire, machine guns firing from 40 to 50 German tanks. I'd like to record here that Sergeant Paul Scott of Cedartown, Georgia, the waist gunner beside whom I was riding, promptly turned his machine guns on the one German tank by a crossroads and claims to have set it on fire. I saw the tank burning. Apart from those tanks, a few bursts of flak, and one report of a coastal battery, I saw no signs of the enemy. Everything that flew in the air or sailed on the sea was definitely and overwhelmingly ours. You'll have to forgive the superlatives, but they're an accurate description of the facts in this case. The air and sea armadas I saw this morning were the biggest nations at war have ever launched at one time. At briefing, before we took off at dawn, the pilots were told to stay below 6,000 feet over England, because that was the level assigned them. Higher up and lower down, the air was full of other planes, fortresses, liberators, lightnings,